All right, today we're going to be talking about the causes of the French Revolution. And just as a sense of where we're headed, so the French Revolution actually separates itself out into periods really nicely. Today we'll talk about the causes, the beginnings of the French Revolution. Next we'll talk about the so-called moderate phase, then we'll talk about the radical phase, and then we'll talk about Napoleon. All right, so the angle that we're going to look at this concept from today is we're going to be looking at what were the primary social, political, economic, and ideological causes of the French Revolution. So start to think about those factors as we go through the next couple of slides. All right. So the first really big cause that I'm going to talk about is the example of the American Revolution. I would say this kind of fits into the ideological category. So you guys probably know a lot about the American Revolution already from 8th grade, but here's just a quick recap, right? Last unit, we talked about the 7 Years' War, which was that sort of first global war at least in the Americas and in Europe. We mentioned that Britain did really well. They kept their colonies in the United States. France did not do so well, but even though Britain did really well, the 7 Years' War put them really deeply in debt. So they decided to solve this problem and raise revenue by raising taxes on the American colonists without the consent of the colonial assemblies. We know how this ends, right? The colonists are like, hey, no taxation without representation. They revolt, they create a republic, and the founding documents that they produce are grounded in Enlightenment philosophy. So this idea of limited government and natural rights and popular sovereignty and the social contract. And as you've probably read the Declaration of Independence, you've seen those ideas, right? So how did the American Revolution, how did that end up contributing to the French Revolution? Well, first of all, really it just suggested that Enlightenment ideals could be put into practice, right? It was one of the first really big revolutions based on Enlightenment philosophy. So it showed that it could be viable, right? And moreover, a lot of French people actually fought on behalf of the colonists, right? Most famously, the Marquis de Lafayette, if you're a big Hamilton fan. And these French folks brought news of the American Revolution back to France. So people in France started to think, hey, that's a pretty good idea. Why don't we do that too? And a really big piece of evidence that shows this influence is the fact that the French will end up writing this document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and this actually really closely resembles the American Declaration of Independence. Right, but it's not just that, right? Another really big factor is massive social inequality in France. So France's system of social classes was called the Ancien Régime, which means the old regime. And my French is terrible, so I'm going to keep calling it the old regime. So the first estate, the estate that was on top, was the clergy. And if it helps you remember, they're the clergy, they're the first estate because they are closest to God, right? That's sort of where that idea that they're the first estate comes from. So this is about 130,000 people, so about 1% of the population. And really importantly, they are exempt from the tithe, which is that land tax that a lot of people in France have to pay. Although they still do pay taxes, they pay a tax every 5 years to the state, but it doesn't really compare to the burden that the tithe imposes on other folks. The clergy is very wealthy. They receive income from tithes, which is money that churches collect. They also own a lot of land, and they collect rent on that land. So that also brings them a lot of money. And they own about 10% of the land in France. Now, there is some division within the clergy. So the elite clergy, so the people at the very top of the church in France, sympathize with the nobles and the monarchy, right? They're wealthy people, so they're influenced by that fact, right? But lower parish priests are influenced by Christian charity, and they sympathize with the commoners that they serve. So they see their suffering and they empathize with them, right? So they side with them in some cases. And a really famous example of this is a guy named Abbé Sieyès. We'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about the moderate phase. All right, the second estate is the nobility. So they're a little bit more of the population. They're about 2% of the population. They're also exempt from the tithe, right? So we can see that really the wealthiest part of our population is exempt from that land tax. And the nobles own a lot more of the land. They own about 25 to 30% of the land. So putting that together, about 40% of the land here is owned by about 3% of the population. So make of that what you will. The nobility also had other advantages. They held high positions in the government, in the military, and industry. And they were also kind of like the clergy. They weren't all necessarily on the side of maintaining the monarchy, maintaining their privileges in the Ancien Regime. There were a lot of pretty highly educated nobles who embraced the Enlightenment, right? They had the free time to sit around and read, right? They had the literacy. So there were some nobles that will end up siding with the French Revolution. Right. Now, the third estate is everybody else. And this is actually a pretty diverse estate. So they're not all like blindingly poor. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got the peasants, who are about 75 to 80% of the population. And as a class, so kind of collectively, they own about 35 to 40% of the land. But more than half of the peasants own little or no land at all. So some peasants are doing pretty well, most peasants not doing so great. In addition to not owning a lot of land, right, the tax burden, as we've mentioned, really falls on them. And not only paying taxes to the state, they're also paying fees to landlords. So feudalism doesn't really exist anymore, but they're still paying a lot of their money in rent to their landlords, right? So above the peasants, you've got skilled artisans, shopkeepers, and other workers. So this is kind of like the urban sort of lower middle class, right? And they're doing okay, but they're going to be hit really hard by some economic crises that hit France in the late 1700s. So especially rising prices, especially the rising price of bread. Then above those, or that sort of lower middle class, we've got the bourgeoisie, who's like the middle class proper, right? And if you've heard that word bougie, it does come from the word bourgeoisie. So that helps you remember. And this class is composed, remember, they're all part of that third estate, right? So everyone here is part of the third estate. But the bourgeoisie is composed of merchants and bankers, educated professionals like doctors and lawyers. Now, this is the class that is really most drawn to the Enlightenment. So you can think about it, if you're a lawyer, busy reading not only law texts or legal texts, but also like political philosophy. That's true of lawyers today. They're real into political theory, some of them. And a lot of our really big French revolutionaries that we'll learn about over the next couple of lessons are from this social class. So Robespierre, who's going to be one of the biggest revolutionaries, is a bourgeois lawyer. Now, some of these members of the bourgeoisie are pretty wealthy, so they have a lot of money, but these folks don't have the same social and political privileges as the nobles, which is going to inspire a lot of resentment. They're like, hey, we're doing pretty well. Why can't we participate in the political system to the same extent as the nobility, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense to us. Now, one thing that's really interesting is there's actually a big debate, or there was sort of a big debate among historians about the role of the bourgeoisie in the French Revolution. So some historians, especially historians from this school of thought called sort of Marxist historiography, so this comes from this 19th century political philosopher named Karl Marx, who we'll learn a lot about when we talk about the Industrial Revolution in the spring. But people who belong to this school of thought argue that the French Revolution was primarily a revolt of the bourgeoisie against the nobility. So amongst sort of all these different groups in France, they're like, actually, it was really just a fight between two groups. So according to this view, the revolution was the product of the fact that the bourgeoisie was upset that they didn't have, or that they had the same or greater economic power than nobility because they had a lot of money, but they didn't have the legal and political and social privileges that the nobility had, right? Let me say this, but modern historians don't actually embrace that view. So Marxist historiography has kind of gone out of fashion, and this is what they argue. So modern historians generally tend to agree that the bourgeoisie and the nobility weren't ideologically unified. So it doesn't really make sense to look at them as like two solid, ideologically separate groups. Some nobles embraced the Enlightenment, some didn't, right? Some members of the bourgeoisie embraced the Enlightenment, some didn't. So it kind of comes down to whether or not they embrace the Enlightenment, not necessarily their sort of economic and political conditions. That's an argument that people make. Moreover, if you are a really wealthy member of the bourgeoisie, you could actually purchase being a noble, right? So again, kind of some overlap there between the bourgeoisie and the nobility. They aren't as separate as we might think they are, right? And then modern historians will also argue that this sort of the Marxist view ignores the interests of and perspectives of other groups involved in the revolution, peasants, workers, et cetera, et cetera. Like, you can't just reduce it to a fight between two classes. There's a lot more going on here. All right. So now let's take a look at cause 3, which is really the political side of this, and that's poor leadership. So last we left off in France, we talked about Louis XIV, right? We talked about some of his weaknesses. These weaknesses are just going to grow amongst his descendants. So the next king of France is Louis XV. He's not a great guy. He's super indecisive. He's easily swayed by his ministers and by his girlfriends. So kind of doesn't really have a strong leadership there. The nobility really took advantage of that weakness, and they gained back a lot of the power that they had lost under Louis XIV. So part, so that's going to give them some influence. So Louis XV gives the High Court of Paris, the Parlement, which is not like Parliament in England. It's sort of like a local government. It's not like a legislature. We'll find there is a legislature, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but we're not quite there yet. So Louis gives the Parlement of Paris the power to approve or disapprove royal decrees. So he gives away some of that absolute power that Louis XIV had accrued. And a lot of these judges in the Parliament, who are mostly nobles, kind of refuse all Louis XV's attempts to raise taxes on the nobility in order to pay for the 7 Years' War. So that debt problem that we saw start to grow under Louis XIV is just going to keep growing. Now, next after Louis XV comes Louis XVI, and all these problems are really going to come to a head. Louis XVI, even more indecisive, even weaker, even less good at spending money. So we will go through his missteps in depth. Here's just a picture. There's Louis XIV. There is Louis XVI. Wrong number. Louis XV. There we go. That's correct. Louis XV. And then there is Louis XVI. And then there is his wife, Marie Antoinette, who's also going to play a role in the French Revolution, as we shall see. All right. So when I say all of Louis XVI's problems kind of come to a head, that is really going to be the big crisis in his reign is an economic crisis. So first of all, bad harvests in the late 1780s, as well as a manufacturing depression. So we've got problems in the countryside and problems in the cities. This is going to cause food prices to rise dramatically, which is going to hit peasants and workers really, really hard. The nobles aren't hard up for food. Peasants and workers definitely are. Meanwhile, poor Louis XVI is not super bright, and he keeps on having parties. He keeps on going to war. He spends all this money on supporting the American Revolution, and this does not inspire great confidence among his citizens. His wife also gets hit really hard with this, so she becomes like this symbol of royal wastefulness. So everyone sees all these portraits of her and her nice dresses and her jewelry, and everyone's like, oh man, Madame Deficit, she is driving France into debt. Obviously, it's not just her fault. There's some misogyny at play here too. But generally, the idea here is that a lot of the Third Estate perceives French leadership as spending money really wastefully and not caring about the interests of the poor. And then the government decides to solve their debt problem by continuing to collect taxes, not from the wealthy people in France, so the nobles and the clergy, but they can't collect taxes from the Third Estate, many of whom can't actually pay those taxes, especially because they're starving to death because food prices are really hard. So the Parlement of Paris continues to just be like, hey, I don't want to raise money on the nobles, so the problem does not get solved. So what Louis decides to do in order to raise money, right, is rather than raise taxes, he decides to borrow money. But France, unlike the Dutch, unlike England, doesn't really have a modern financial system and central bank, so they rely on loans from private banks. Now, as you can imagine, right, these private banks look at what the government of France is doing. They're like, bro, you're paying all this money for parties and supporting, like this fun side project with the American Revolution. You aren't going to pay that money back, are you? You can't afford to do that. So they actually start to stop lending the French government money, which plunges them further into debt, and those debts are going to come due. Right. So what does Louis XVI do? Well, he makes a good move at first. He appoints this guy named Jacques Necker as his finance minister. Necker doesn't really do a whole lot in terms of reform, and he continues to try and get loans rather than raise taxes. But he's pretty popular. He has this reputation for being kind of ethical and transparent and hardworking. And then Louis makes the move of firing him, which further angers people. And they're like, wait a minute, we like this guy. Why did you get rid of him? Now, Louis then appoints this guy named Charles de Calonne, who's like, okay, the country's going to fall into bankruptcy if we don't raise taxes, so we gotta raise taxes. So what he does is he convenes this thing called an Assembly of Notables, which is nobles and other various important people, and he's like, hey, guys, we gotta raise taxes. Really, this is not working, right? And the Assembly of Notables says, no, we don't want to raise taxes. So Louis XVI is like, oh my God, I have a problem here. So he's like, okay, well, if I'm going to raise taxes, I need to get all three estates on board here, right? He's like, I got to make the nobles pay taxes. I got to make the clergy pay more taxes. So what he decides to do is he agrees to summon what's called the Estates General. Now, this is kind of like England's parliament. This is kind of like a legislative body. So it's a meeting of all three estates. But the problem is that this group hasn't been convened since 1614, so it hasn't been convened in a long time. So Louis says, guys, I need help. Let's solve this financial crisis. But as we will see in the next lecture, this spirals out of control and leads to the French Revolution.